On August 3, 2006, at approximately 11:45 p.m., 20-year-old Claudia Gutierrez Cruz was walking home from her job as a waitress at a Mexican restaurant in Phoenix, Arizona, moving quickly along South 12th Street in a neighborhood where streetlights were sparse and where the August heat, still over 90 degrees even at midnight, made the air feel thick and oppressive. She was less than 2 blocks from her apartment, was talking on her cell phone with her boyfriend, was looking forward to getting home and escaping the heat when a white SUV pulled up alongside her, slowed to match her walking pace, and the driver, a white male in his late 30s whom Claudia had never seen before, called out, "Excuse me, miss, do you need a ride?" Claudia waved him off without making eye contact, kept walking, told her boyfriend, "Some guy is trying to get me to get in his car," and walked faster toward her apartment building. The SUV accelerated suddenly, turned the corner ahead of her, and Claudia felt a moment of relief thinking the man had driven away. But then she heard the SUV's engine again behind her, heard it approaching fast, and in the split second before impact, she understood that the driver wasn't trying to offer her a ride. He was trying to run her down. The SUV hit Claudia from behind at approximately 30 miles per hour, threw her body over the hood and against the windshield, sent her flying through the air before she landed hard on the pavement 15 feet away. The driver didn't stop, didn't slow down, accelerated away from the scene, leaving Claudia broken and dying on South 12th Street, while her boyfriend screamed through the phone, asking what had happened, asking why she'd screamed, asking if she was okay. Claudia Gutierrez Cruz died 3 hours later at St. Joseph's Hospital from massive internal injuries and from bleeding that doctors couldn't control, became the 6th murder victim in what would eventually be recognized as one of the most unusual and most prolific serial killing sprees in American history. A 15-month rampage where Dale Hausner and his accomplice Samuel Diedemann would kill at least 8 people and would attempt to kill dozens more, shooting randomly at pedestrians and bicyclists and homeless people, running people down with vehicles, setting fires to occupied houses, committing violence for no discernible reason beyond the thrill of killing, and doing it all while Hausner maintained a seemingly normal life that included working as a local television news editor who'd once interviewed Mike Tyson, who'd worked on coverage of major stories, who seemed like a regular professional guy that no one would suspect of being a serial killer who was murdering people during his off hours for entertainment. If you have the courage to hear this story, click here to find out what happened, but I warn you, the details reveal a pattern of random violence that was nearly impossible to detect or prevent until investigators finally connected dozens of seemingly unrelated crimes. This narrative explores how Dale Hausner and Samuel Diedemann terrorized Phoenix, Arizona between May 2005 and August 2006, how they killed and wounded victims who were selected completely at random with no connection to the killers, how Hausner maintained a double life as respected television journalist while committing murders during his off hours, how the randomness of the violence made investigation extraordinarily difficult, and how the case demonstrated that some serial killers don't fit traditional profiles, don't target specific victim types, don't follow predictable patterns, don't leave the kind of evidence that allows investigators to identify them before their killing sprees end either through arrest or through the killer's decisions to stop. Hook. The random violence pattern. What made the Dale Hausner case extraordinary, and what made it nearly impossible to solve until Hausner and Diedemann were caught through other means, was the complete randomness of their violence. Traditional serial killers target specific victim types. Prostitutes, hitchhikers, children, elderly people, operate in specific geographic areas, follow patterns that allow investigators to predict where they might strike next, and to develop profiles that narrow suspect lists. Hausner and Diedemann followed no patterns. Their victims were selected randomly: pedestrians walking at night, people waiting at bus stops, homeless people sleeping outdoors, bicyclists riding on streets, anyone who happened to be in the wrong place when Hausner and Diedemann were driving around looking for targets. Their methods varied. Sometimes they shot at victims from moving vehicles. Sometimes they ran people down with cars or trucks. Sometimes they set fires. Sometimes they attacked people directly, showing no consistency in methodology that would allow investigators to recognize the attacks as connected. Their geographic range was enormous. They committed attacks across the entire Phoenix metropolitan area, a region covering over 500 square miles, making it impossible to predict where they'd strike next or to concentrate police resources in specific high-risk areas. Their victim demographics varied completely. They killed men and women, killed people of different races and ages, killed people in different neighborhoods, showed no preference for any particular victim type that would help investigators understand who was at risk. Their timing was unpredictable. Attacks occurred on different days of the week, at different times of night, with no pattern that would allow police to increase patrols during high-risk periods. This randomness meant that even though Hausner and Diedemann committed dozens of attacks over 15 months, even though they killed 8 people and wounded many more, investigators didn't recognize that most of these attacks were connected until very late in the spree. Each shooting, each hit and run, each fire was initially investigated as a separate incident, and only gradually did patterns emerge suggesting that a single perpetrator or team of perpetrators might be responsible for multiple crimes. Stakes: the terror of random violence. The stakes in the Hausner-Diedemann case extended far beyond the deaths of their 8 murder victims. At issue was the fundamental security that people expect when walking on public streets, the assumption that random violence from strangers is rare enough that normal activities don't require constant vigilance, and the question of how law enforcement responds to serial killing that doesn't follow traditional patterns. The public safety implications. Random violence is particularly terrifying because it's unpredictable and unpreventable. Anyone could be a victim. When serial killers target specific types of people, the general public can feel relatively safe if they don't match the victim profile. But when killers select victims completely randomly, everyone is potentially at risk, creating pervasive fear that affects entire communities. Normal activities become dangerous. Walking to work, waiting for a bus, riding a bicycle, even sleeping in one's own home, for people whose homes were set on fire, became potentially deadly activities, transforming routine daily life into a series of calculated risks. No protective measures are effective when violence is truly random. Traditional safety measures, avoiding dangerous areas, not going out alone at night, being aware of surroundings, don't necessarily help because victims are being attacked in areas that should be safe, during times when people need to be out, in circumstances where vigilance wouldn't prevent attacks from vehicles or from shooters firing from distance. The fear is self-perpetuating. Each attack creates more fear, even among people who weren't directly affected, creating climate of anxiety where everyone worries they might be next, where trust in public safety deteriorates, where a normal community, life is disrupted by pervasive fear. By mid-2006, Phoenix residents were experiencing exactly this kind of terror. People were afraid to walk at night. Homeless populations were particularly terrified, since multiple victims had been homeless. Neighborhoods were organizing watch groups, and the general sense was that a predator or predators were hunting people randomly, and that no one was safe. The investigation challenges. Random serial killing presents extraordinary challenges for law enforcement. Connecting crimes is difficult. When victims have nothing in common, when crime scenes are scattered across wide geographic areas, when methods vary, investigators often don't realize that crimes are connected until late in the investigation, meaning resources aren't concentrated and patterns aren't recognized early. Traditional profiling doesn't work. FBI behavioral analysis and criminal profiling typically rely on identifying patterns in victim selection in crime scene, characteristics in killer behavior that reveal psychological motivations, and that narrow suspect pools. When killers are truly random, these profiling techniques are less effective. Witness information is minimal. Many attacks occurred at night in areas without witnesses, or witnesses saw only a vehicle driving away without being able to identify the driver or to provide detailed vehicle descriptions. Physical evidence is limited. Shootings from moving vehicles don't leave much physical evidence at scenes. Hit-and-run attacks might leave paint transfer or tire marks, but often don't provide enough evidence to identify specific vehicles, and fires destroy evidence rather than creating it. The investigative resources required are enormous when potentially dozens of crimes might be connected, when the geographic area is massive, when each crime needs to be investigated thoroughly while also being compared to all other potentially related crimes. The manpower and coordination required exceeds what most police departments can sustain long-term. Phoenix Police Department and multiple other agencies in the Phoenix metropolitan area were overwhelmed by the Hausner-Diedemann spree, were investigating dozens of attacks without initially recognizing they were connected, and were struggling to provide public safety while also investigating crimes that seemed unsolvable without either catching killers in the act or receiving information from informants. The psychological impact on communities. Random serial killing affects communities differently than targeted serial killing. trust deteriorates. When neighbors might be killers, when the guy who edits television news coverage might be committing murders during his off hours, when there's no way to identify who's dangerous, trust in fellow community members deteriorates and social bonds weaken. Victim blaming becomes impossible. When victims are clearly random, when nothing about their behavior or their circumstances made them vulnerable, the tendency to blame victims, they were in a dangerous area, they shouldn't have been out alone, is eliminated, forcing confrontation with the reality that violence can strike anyone, regardless of precautions. The randomness creates existential fear. Targeted violence, where specific groups are at risk, creates fear but also allows most people to feel relatively safe if they're not in the targeted group. Random violence eliminates that psychological buffer, forces everyone to confront their vulnerability, creates the kind of pervasive anxiety that affects entire populations rather than just high-risk groups. By the time Hausner and Diedemann were arrested in August 2006, Phoenix was a city in fear, was experiencing the kind of mass anxiety that follows terrorist attacks or natural disasters, was collectively traumatized by 15 months of random violence that had killed 8 people and had wounded or traumatized dozens more. The setting, Phoenix, Arizona, 2005-2006. To understand the Hausner-Diedemann killing spree, one must understand the setting, Phoenix, Arizona, in the mid-2000s, a sprawling Sunbelt metropolis where rapid growth, extreme summer heat, and vast geographic scale created circumstances where serial killers could operate with relative impunity. The geography Phoenix in 2005-2006 was the 5th largest city in the United States, with a population of approximately 1.5 million in the city proper and over 4 million in the metropolitan area. The city covered over 500 square miles, was characterized by endless sprawl where urban and suburban areas blended together, where there was no clear downtown or center, where development spread in all directions, limited only by mountain ranges and by Native American reservations. This geography created several conditions relevant to the Hausner-Diedemann case. Enormous distances between neighborhoods. Crimes committed on opposite sides of Phoenix might be 40 miles apart, making it difficult for investigators to recognize patterns suggesting the crimes were connected, making it impossible for police to concentrate patrols in high-risk areas when the entire metropolitan area was potentially at risk. Car-dependent culture. Phoenix was built for automobiles, had minimal public transportation, expected that people would drive everywhere, creating an environment where vehicles were omnipresent and where vehicles driving through neighborhoods at night didn't attract attention or suspicion. Extensive road networks. Phoenix had thousands of miles of roads ranging from major highways to small residential streets, providing countless routes for killers driving around looking for victims, making it easy to commit crimes and to escape without being trapped or cornered by police. Low-density development. Much of Phoenix was low-density suburban sprawl, where houses were spread out, where streets had minimal pedestrian traffic, where someone walking at night might not encounter other people. For blocks, creating vulnerability for pedestrians who were isolated and who wouldn't be seen by witnesses if attacked. The climate. Phoenix's extreme climate was relevant to the killing spree. Summer heat. Phoenix summers regularly exceed 110 degrees during the day and remain above 90 degrees even at night, creating conditions where outdoor activities are uncomfortable or dangerous, where people stay indoors during peak heat, where the few people who are outside at night, often because they're homeless or because they're commuting from low-wage jobs, are particularly vulnerable because there are fewer potential witnesses. Dark streets. Many Phoenix neighborhoods, particularly lower-income areas, had inadequate street lighting, creating darkness at night that made it difficult for victims to see approaching vehicles, made it difficult for witnesses to identify attackers, made it easier for killers to commit crimes without being observed. Year-round outdoor activity, unlike northern cities. Where winter weather keeps people indoors, Phoenix's mild winter weather meant people were outside year-round, meaning potential victims were always available, meaning the killing spree could continue through all seasons without weather-limiting opportunities. The demographics. Phoenix's population demographics were relevant to understanding victim selection and to understanding why the randomness of attacks was particularly terrifying. Diverse population. Phoenix was racially and economically diverse, included large Hispanic, Native American, and white populations, included neighborhoods ranging from wealthy to impoverished, meaning that truly random victim selection would result in diverse victim demographics that investigators eventually observed. Large homeless population. Phoenix's mild winter climate attracted homeless people from colder regions, resulted in substantial homeless population living on streets and in desert areas surrounding the city, created vulnerable population that Hausner and Diedemann targeted multiple times because homeless people were often alone at night in isolated areas. Economic inequality. Phoenix had significant economic inequality with wealthy neighborhoods adjacent to poor neighborhoods, with service workers commuting from affordable areas to work in wealthier areas, creating situations where people were walking or waiting for buses at night in areas where they were isolated and vulnerable. The law enforcement context. Phoenix Police Department in 2005-2006 was a large professional force but was stretched thin by the city's size and by crime rates that were higher than national averages. Approximately 3,000 sworn officers serving a city of 1.5 million people and covering over 500 square miles meant that police presence was spread thin, that response times to non-emergency calls could be slow, that surveillance and patrol coverage of the entire city was impossible. High crime rates meant police were responding to thousands of calls for service daily, were investigating numerous violent crimes simultaneously, had limited resources for extended investigations of individual cases unless those cases were clearly highest priority. Multiple jurisdictions complicated investigations. The Phoenix metropolitan area included multiple cities: Phoenix, Scottsdale, Mesas, Tempe, Glendale, and others, each with independent police departments, plus county sheriffs covering unincorporated areas, creating coordination challenges when crimes crossed jurisdictional boundaries. Limited technological resources in 2005-2006, before widespread use of automated license plate readers, before extensive networks of surveillance cameras, before social media that could be monitored for threats. Police relied primarily on traditional investigation methods, witness interviews, physical evidence, informants, that were less effective for solving random crimes committed by perpetrators with no connection to victims. This law enforcement context meant that even a large professional police force was struggling to identify and stop serial killers who were committing random attacks across a vast geographic area, who left minimal evidence, who had no connection to their victims that would lead investigators to identify them. The killer, Dale Hausner. Dale S. Hausner was born on July 7, 1973, in Apache Junction, Arizona, grew up in the Phoenix area, and by all outward appearances led a normal, even successful life before his arrest in August 2006 revealed that he'd been one of Arizona's most prolific serial killers. The background Hausner's childhood and early adulthood provided few obvious warning signs of the violence he'd later commit. Middle-class upbringing. Hausner grew up in a stable middle-class family, wasn't abused or neglected in ways that traditionally correlate with violent criminality, attended school normally, didn't have the kind of traumatic childhood that often characterizes serial killers' backgrounds. Academic achievement. Hausner was intelligent, did well in school, showed particular interest in journalism and media, pursued education and training that would lead to career in television news. Professional success. By his early 30s, Hausner was working as a news editor for local television stations in Phoenix, had worked for CBS affiliate KPHO and for other stations, had professional responsibilities including editing video footage and producing news segments, and had even been assigned to interview celebrities and athletes, including boxer Mike Tyson, during an event in Phoenix. The Mike Tyson interview? This interview became notable after Hausner's arrest because it seemed so incongruous. Hausner sitting calmly asking questions of one of the most famous and controversial athletes in the world, presenting himself as professional journalist, giving no indication that he was simultaneously, during the same period when he was conducting professional interviews, committing random murders during his off hours. Social functioning. Hausner had roommates, maintained employment, had girlfriend relationships at various points, participated in normal social activities, presented outwardly as someone who was functioning normally in society rather than as someone who was committing serial murders. The psychological profile. After his arrest, psychological evaluations of Hausner revealed characteristics that, in retrospect, explained his capacity for random violence, but that hadn't been obvious to people who knew him. Antisocial personality traits. Hausner showed lack of empathy, lack of remorse, superficial charm that allowed him to maintain normal social relationships while secretly viewing other people as objects rather than as human beings deserving of moral consideration. Thrill-seeking behavior. Hausner described the killings in interviews with investigators as being motivated primarily by the excitement of hunting humans, by the adrenaline rush of committing violence and escaping without being caught, by the sense of power that came from determining who would live or die. Narcissistic traits. Hausner viewed himself as smarter than police, believed he could commit crimes indefinitely without being caught, took satisfaction in the media coverage of the attacks, some of which he himself had edited as part of his job, enjoyed the sense that he knew things that authorities and the public didn't know. Compartmentalization. Hausner was able to completely separate his professional life and his killing activities, could edit news coverage of the very crimes he'd committed without showing any emotional response, could maintain friendships and work relationships while secretly viewing those same people with the same detachment he viewed his victims. Lack of traditional serial killer motivations. Hausner didn't kill for sexual gratification, like many serial killers. Didn't kill specific victim types who represented something from his past. Didn't have delusional beliefs that motivated his killings. He killed simply because he enjoyed it, because it was entertaining, because the thrill of hunting humans provided excitement that normal life didn't provide. This psychological profile made Hausner particularly dangerous because he fit no traditional serial killer profile. He wasn't a loner, wasn't obviously mentally ill, wasn't the kind of person that neighbors or coworkers would later say, "We always knew something was wrong with him." He was hiding in plain sight, functioning normally in professional and social contexts while committing horrific crimes during his off hours. The accomplice, Samuel Diedemann. Samuel John Diedemann, born in 1970, was Dale Hausner's roommate and eventually his partner in the killing spree. Diedemann's involvement in the crimes was somewhat different from Hausner's. Diedemann appears to have been a follower rather than an initiator, someone who participated in violence at Hausner's instigation, rather than someone who would have committed these crimes independently. The background. Diedemann's background was less stable than Hausner's. Working-class background. Diedemann came from working-class family, had less education than Hausner, worked various jobs including construction and warehouse work, didn't have the professional career or the outward success that Hausner had achieved. Social isolation. Diedemann was more socially isolated than Hausner, had fewer friends, seemed to depend on Hausner for social interaction and for direction in his life. Criminal history. Diedemann had some minor criminal history before the killing spree, primarily drug-related offenses and theft, suggesting pattern of antisocial behavior that predated his relationship with Hausner, but that hadn't previously escalated to violence. The relationship with Hausner-Diedemann and Hausner became roommates, and their relationship developed into partnership where Hausner was dominant and Diedemann was follower. Hausner initiated the violence. According to subsequent investigations and to Diedemann's testimony after his arrest, Hausner was the one who suggested committing random attacks, who planned the operations, who seemed to derive the most satisfaction from the killings. Diedemann participated willingly. While Diedemann may have been following Hausner's lead, he participated actively in the crimes, drove vehicles during some attacks, shot at victims himself during others, and showed no reluctance that would suggest he was being forced to participate against his will. The dynamic was collaborative. The two men would drive around together at night, would look for potential victims together, would discuss who to target and how to attack, functioning as a team rather than as leader and completely unwilling participant. This partnership made the killing spree more effective and more difficult to stop. Two perpetrators could cover more ground, could provide mutual support and encouragement that sustained the violence longer than either might have sustained it alone, and created complications for investigation when witnesses might describe two different suspects or when different crimes showed different patterns suggesting different perpetrators. The timeline. 15 months of terror. The Hausner-Diedemann killing spree occurred over approximately 15 months between May 2005 and August 2006, during which they committed at least 8 murders and dozens of additional attacks that wounded victims or that failed to cause injuries either because they missed or because victims survived their wounds. May 2005. The beginning. The spree appears to have begun in May 2005 with attacks that were initially not connected. May 6, 2005. Robin Blasnick, 22, was shot while walking her dog in Mesa, Arizona. She survived her injuries but was critically wounded, spent weeks in hospital recovering. May 18, 2005. David Estrada, 20, was shot while walking in Phoenix. The bullet grazed him, causing minor injuries. Police initially classified this as random drive-by shooting, unrelated to other incidents. These early attacks established the pattern that would continue: random victims, shootings from vehicles, no apparent motive, minimal evidence left at scenes. Summer 2005, escalation. Through summer 2005, attacks continued and intensified. June 29, 2005, Paul Patrick, 21, was standing outside his apartment when he was shot from a passing vehicle. He survived but required extensive medical treatment. July 17, 2005. Multiple shootings occurred on this single night. At least 4 different victims were shot at from passing vehicles in different areas of Phoenix, suggesting the killers were driving around for hours looking for targets. All victims survived, but several were seriously wounded. August 6, 2005. Nathaniel Schaffner, 20, was shot while walking near his home. He was critically wounded, survived after multiple surgeries. By late summer 2005, Phoenix police were beginning to recognize that multiple shootings might be connected. Ballistics evidence suggested the same firearm had been used in several attacks. Witness descriptions of vehicles were similar enough to suggest a pattern, and the randomness of victim selection suggested a serial offender rather than multiple unconnected crimes. Fall 2005, first murders. The violence escalated from woundings to murders in fall 2005. October 23, 2005. Marco Carrillo, 20, was shot and killed while sitting in his car in Mesa. This was the first confirmed murder in the spree, marked the transition from attempted murders to successful killings. November 5, 2005. Multiple animals were shot. Dogs and horses in rural areas outside Phoenix were killed in what appeared to be target practice or entertainment for the killers. These animal killings were later recognized as part of the pattern, suggesting the killers were escalating their violence and were practicing on animals when human victims weren't available. December 11, 2005. Jose Ortiz, 21, was shot and killed while walking in Phoenix. Like Carrillo, Ortiz was a random victim with no connection to the killers. By end of 2005, investigators were convinced they were dealing with serial killers, had created task force to coordinate investigation across multiple jurisdictions, and were beginning to warn the public that a random shooter or shooters were operating in the Phoenix area. Winter-spring 2006, continued violence. The violence continued through winter and spring 2006. January 2006, multiple shootings and one arson fire at a house in Phoenix that endangered the occupants. The arson represented new methodology. Rather than just shooting at people, the killers were now setting fires to occupied buildings, escalating both the danger and the variety of their attacks. February 13, 2006. Robin Blasnek, who'd survived being shot in May 2005, was shot again in a separate incident. She survived again, but the repeat targeting suggested either that the killers remembered previous victims or that she'd been randomly selected twice. March 2, 2006. Claudia Gutierrez Cruz was run down and killed by a vehicle, as described in the opening of this narrative. This was the first confirmed vehicular homicide in the spree. April 12, 2006. Multiple shootings across Phoenix on a single night, with at least 3 victims wounded. May 2006. More shootings, more arsons, the violence continuing at pace that suggested the killers had no intention of stopping voluntarily. Summer 2006. The final murders. The final murders in the spree occurred in summer 2006. June 2006, Marie Camacho, 22, was shot and killed while walking in Phoenix. She became the 6th murder victim. June 29, 2006. 1 year after multiple shootings on the same date in 2005, another wave of attacks injured several victims but killed no one. July 2006. 2 more murder victims, bringing the total to 8 confirmed murders plus dozens of attempted murders, wounded victims, and property crimes, including arsons and animal killings. By late July 2006, the Phoenix area was in state of panic. The media was covering the serial shooter and baseline killer cases extensively. Note, the baseline killer was a separate serial killer, operating simultaneously in Phoenix, adding to the terror. Police were receiving enormous public pressure to solve the cases, and the sense was that nowhere was safe and that the killings would continue indefinitely unless the perpetrators were caught. The investigation, connecting the dots. The investigation into what became known as the serial shooter case was extraordinarily complex, involving multiple agencies, hundreds of investigators, analysis of dozens of crime scenes, and ultimately required technological assistance and an informant to identify the perpetrators. The ballistics evidence. One of the first breaks in recognizing the crimes as connected came from ballistics analysis. Shell casings recovered from multiple shooting scenes were analyzed by firearms examiners who determined they'd been fired from the same weapon, a .410 shotgun that was relatively unusual. Most shootings involved handguns or rifles, so the .410 shotgun was distinctive enough to help connect crimes. Bullet and pellet evidence from victims' wounds showed consistent patterns suggesting the same weapons were being used across multiple attacks. This ballistics evidence allowed investigators to definitively connect approximately 30 shootings as being committed by the same perpetrator or perpetrators, transforming what had been viewed as unconnected random crimes into a coordinated serial killing spree. The vehicle evidence witness descriptions of vehicles seen fleeing crime scenes provided another investigative lead. Multiple witnesses described a white or light-colored SUV or truck at various crime scenes, though descriptions varied enough that it wasn't initially clear whether multiple vehicles were involved or whether witnesses were describing the same vehicle differently. Paint transfer from the Claudia Gutierrez Cruz hit and run provided evidence about the vehicle's color and type, narrowing the search to specific makes and models. Tire track evidence from multiple scenes showed consistent patterns suggesting the same vehicle or vehicles had been present at different crime scenes. But even with vehicle descriptions, finding specific vehicles in a metropolitan area of 4 million people, where hundreds of thousands of white SUVs and trucks were registered, was nearly impossible without additional information. The geographic profiling investigators used geographic profiling, analyzing the locations of crimes to identify areas where perpetrators might live or work. The attacks clustered in certain areas of Phoenix more than in others, suggesting the perpetrators were familiar with those areas or lived near them. Attack times suggested the perpetrators were most active late at night and in early morning. Hours, consistent with someone who worked during the day and committed crimes during off hours. Travel patterns between crime scenes suggested the perpetrators were using major highways to move quickly across the metropolitan area, were familiar with Phoenix's road network, were comfortable navigating the city. This geographic analysis helped narrow the search to certain regions of Phoenix, but wasn't specific enough to identify particular suspects. The media coverage Phoenix news media covered the serial shooter case extensively, which had both positive and negative effects. Public awareness increased, people became more cautious, reported suspicious activities more frequently, provided tips to police based on media coverage. Fear intensified. The extensive coverage created climate of terror, made people afraid to go outside at night, damaged Phoenix's reputation and tourism. The killers were watching. Dale Hausner, as a news editor, was literally editing some of the coverage of his own crimes, was aware of what police were saying publicly about the investigation, could adjust his methods based on what he learned from media coverage. The irony of Hausner editing news coverage of his own killing spree was discovered only after his arrest, when investigators realized he'd had access to police press conferences, to investigative details shared with media, to all the information that was being released to the public about the hunt for the serial shooter. The break. The informant. The case was ultimately solved not through traditional investigative methods, but through an informant, Ron Horton, who'd met Samuel Diedemann and who became suspicious about Diedemann's behavior and statements. Horton met Diedemann in summer 2006, became concerned when Diedemann made statements suggesting he knew things about the serial shooter crimes, that he had information that shouldn't be publicly known. Horton contacted police in late July 2006, reported his suspicions about Diedemann, provided information that focused the investigation on Diedemann and, through him, on Dale Hausner. Surveillance began on Hausner and Diedemann, with police watching their movements, documenting their vehicle, preparing to arrest them if evidence could be developed connecting them to the crimes. On August 4, 2006, just days after Horton's tip, police arrested Samuel Diedemann on unrelated outstanding warrants, allowing them to question him about the serial shooter crimes. Diedemann confessed after several hours of interrogation, admitted his participation in the killing spree, implicated Dale Hausner as the primary perpetrator and planner, provided detailed information about crimes that only the perpetrators would know. Dale Hausner was arrested on August 4, 2006 at his home. Evidence seized from the home and from vehicles connected to Hausner and Diedemann included firearms matching those used in the shootings, evidence of arsons and other physical evidence connecting them to the crimes. The arrests ended the 15-month terror, brought relief to Phoenix residents who'd been living in fear, and began the legal process that would ultimately result in both men being convicted and sentenced for their crimes. The legal proceedings, justice and death sentences. The legal proceedings against Dale Hausner and Samuel Diedemann were complex, involving numerous charges across multiple jurisdictions, separate trials, and ultimately resulted in death sentences for both men. The charges Hausner and Diedemann were charged with 8 counts of first-degree murder for the confirmed killing of 8 victims, dozens of counts of attempted murder for victims who were shot or run down but survived, multiple counts of arson for fires set to occupied buildings, animal cruelty charges for killing dogs and horses, numerous other charges including assault, endangerment, weapons violations, conspiracy. The total number of charges exceeded 80 counts, making it one of the largest serial killer prosecutions in Arizona history. Diedemann's trial and plea deal. Samuel Diedemann, recognizing that his cooperation had already damaged his defense and that the evidence against him was overwhelming, negotiated a plea deal. He pleaded guilty to 2 counts of murder and multiple other charges in exchange for prosecutors agreeing not to seek the death penalty. He was sentenced to life in prison without possibility of parole, avoiding execution, but ensuring he'd never be released. He testified against Dale Hausner during Hausner's trial, providing detailed first-hand accounts of how the crimes were planned and committed, corroborating the physical evidence and eliminating any doubt about Hausner's guilt. Hausner's trial. Dale Hausner went to trial in 2009, maintaining his innocence despite overwhelming evidence. The prosecution presented ballistics evidence linking Hausner's weapons to crime scenes, forensic evidence from vehicles showing paint transfer and other physical connections too. Crimes Diedemann's testimony describing Hausner's role as primary perpetrator, circumstantial evidence, including Hausner's work schedule that showed he was off work during times when crimes occurred, psychological evidence suggesting Hausner had the personality traits consistent with serial killing. The defense argued that Diedemann was the primary perpetrator and was falsely implicating Hausner to reduce his own sentence, that physical evidence was circumstantial and didn't definitively prove Hausner's guilt, that prosecutors couldn't prove beyond reasonable doubt that Hausner rather than Diedemann had committed specific murders. The jury deliberated for several days before convicting Hausner on 6 counts of first-degree murder and on multiple other charges. He was acquitted on 2 murder counts where evidence was less definitive. The sentencing phase resulted in the jury recommending death sentences for the murders, which the judge imposed, sending Hausner to Arizona's death row. The aftermath. Dale Hausner was on death row at Arizona State Prison Complex in Florence, Arizona, where he was found dead on June 19, 2013, at age 39. His death was ruled a suicide. He'd apparently overdosed on amitriptyline, an antidepressant, that he'd been stockpiling from his prescribed medication. By committing suicide, Hausner avoided execution, but also avoided spending decades on death row appealing his conviction. Samuel Diedemann remains in prison serving his life sentence, will never be released, will die in custody. Resolution: the meaning of random violence. The Dale Hausner case offers several disturbing lessons about serial killing, about the limitations of criminal profiling, and about how random violence terrorizes communities in ways that targeted violence doesn't. The failure of traditional profiling. Hausner didn't fit traditional serial killer profiles. He wasn't a loner. He had roommates, maintained employment, had social relationships. He wasn't obviously mentally ill. He functioned normally in professional settings, showed no outward signs of the psychopathy that characterized his secret life. He didn't target specific victim types. His victims were completely random, suggesting his motivation was the thrill of killing rather than any psychological need to kill specific types of people. He didn't leave traditional signatures. His methods varied. His crime scenes showed no ritualistic elements. Nothing about the crimes suggested psychological patterns that profilers could use to understand or predict his behavior. This demonstrates limitations of traditional profiling, when killers don't follow expected patterns, when their motivations are simple, I enjoy killing. Rather than complex traditional investigative techniques become less effective, and catching such killers becomes more dependent on luck, informants, or catching them in the act. The terror of randomness. Random serial killing creates unique terror. Anyone could be next. When? Victims are truly random when there's no way to identify who's at risk. Entire populations feel vulnerable in ways that don't occur when only specific groups are targeted. Normal precautions don't help. avoiding dangerous areas, not going out alone, being aware of surroundings. These traditional safety measures don't protect against random attacks from vehicles or from shooters firing from distance. Trust in public safety deteriorates when random violence occurs over extended periods without being stopped. When police seem unable to identify or catch perpetrators, public confidence in law enforcement and in government's ability to provide security diminishes. The Phoenix community's response to the serial shooter case, the fear, the changes in behavior, the demand for police action, demonstrated how profoundly random violence affects social cohesion and public safety perceptions. The question of motivation. Why did Hausner kill? The simple answer appears to be because he enjoyed it. Unlike serial killers motivated by sexual gratification, by revenge, by delusional beliefs, Hausner killed for entertainment, for the thrill, because hunting humans provided excitement. This motivation is disturbing precisely because it's so simple. It suggests that some people are capable of viewing other humans purely as objects or as prey, that empathy and moral constraints that prevent most people from murder simply don't exist in some individuals, and that such people can hide their true nature while functioning normally in society. The legacy. The Hausner case left lasting impacts on Phoenix. Improved multi-agency cooperation. The investigation demonstrated need for better coordination between jurisdictions, led to improvements in how Phoenix area law enforcement agencies work together on complex cases. Enhanced ballistics databases. The case showed value of ballistic analysis for connecting crimes, led to improvements in how firearms evidence is cataloged and compared across cases. Greater public awareness. Phoenix residents became more aware of random violence risks, more vigilant about reporting suspicious activities, more engaged with public safety issues. Ongoing questions about detection. The fact that Hausner operated for 15 months, killed 8 people, wounded dozens more, and was caught only through an informant rather than through investigative work, raises uncomfortable questions about whether similar killers might be operating undetected in other cities, whether random serial violence is harder to detect than generally acknowledged. If you found this exploration of Dale Hausner's killing spree compelling, like and subscribe for more investigations into true crime cases that reveal how serial killers operate and how investigations work to identify and stop them. Share this with anyone interested in criminal psychology, in the challenges of investigating random violence, or in understanding how seemingly normal people can commit horrific crimes. Comment below, how can communities protect themselves from random serial violence? What investigative techniques might be more effective for catching killers who don't follow traditional patterns? Should there be greater screening or monitoring of people in positions like Hausner's who have access to crime scene information through their professional work? Until next time, remember, the scariest monsters aren't always the ones who look like monsters. Dale Hausner was a television news editor who interviewed Mike Tyson, who worked alongside respected journalists, who seemed completely normal to everyone who knew him. But during his off hours, he was driving around Phoenix shooting random people, running them down with vehicles, setting fires to occupied homes, killing for entertainment rather than for any comprehensible reason. His victims never knew him, never did anything to provoke his violence, were simply in the wrong place when he was looking for someone to kill. The randomness of his violence made it nearly impossible to prevent and extraordinarily difficult to investigate, demonstrated that some serial killers don't follow the patterns that profilers expect, and revealed that the capacity for murder can hide behind the most normal-seeming exteriors. 8 people died because Dale Hausner enjoyed killing, because Samuel Diedemann was willing to participate, and because for 15 months they were able to hunt humans across Phoenix without being caught. Their arrest brought the violence to an end, but the terror they created and the questions they raised about how to identify and stop random serial killers remain relevant wherever such killers might operate.